John Brown by W.E.B. DuBois. Chapter 12. The Riddle of the Sphinx. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. The deed was done. The next day the world knew, and the world sat in puzzled amazement. It was ever so, and ever will be. When a prophet like John Brown appears, how must we of the world receive him? Must we follow out the drear, dread logic of surrounding facts, as did the South, even if they crucify a clean and pure soul, simply because consistent allegiance to our cherished, chosen ideal demands it? If we do, the shame will brand our latest history. Shall we hesitate and waver before his clear white logic, now helping, now fearing to help, now believing, now doubting? Yes, this we must do so long as doubt and hesitation are genuine, but we must not lie. If we are human, we must thus hesitate until we know the right. How shall we know it? That is the riddle of the Sphinx. We are but darkened, groping souls that know not light, often because of its very blinding radiance. Only in time is truth revealed. Today, at last, we know. John Brown was right. Yet there are some great principles to guide us. That there are in this world matters of vast human import which are eternally right or eternally wrong, all men believe. Whether that great light comes, as the simpler, clearer minded think, from the spoken word of God, or whether it is simply another way of saying, this deed makes for the good of mankind, or that for the ill. However it may be, all men know that there are, in this world, here and there and again, great partings of the ways, the one way wrong, the other right, in some vast and eternal sense. This certainty is true at times, in the mighty crises of lives and nations. On the other hand, it is also true, as human experience again and again shows, that the usual matters of human debate and difference of opinion are not so vitally important or so easily classified, that in most cases there is much of right and wrong on both sides, and, so usual it is to find this true, that men tend to argue it always so. Their life morality becomes always a wavering path of expediency, not necessarily the best or the worst path, as they freely, even smilingly admit, but a good path, a safe path, a path of little resistance, and one that leads to the good, if not to the theoretical, but usually impracticable, best. Such philosophy of the world's ways is common, and probably it is well that thus it is. And yet we all feel its temporary, tentative character. We instinctively distrust its comfortable tone, and listen almost fearfully for the greater voice. Its better is often so far below that which we feel is a possible best, that its present temporizing seems evil to us, and ever and again after the world has complacently dodged and compromised with, and skilfully evaded, a great evil, there shines suddenly a great white light, an unwavering, unflickering brightness, blinding by its all-seeing brilliance, making the whole world simply a light and a darkness, a right and a wrong. Then men tremble and writhe and waver. They whisper, But of course, the thing is plain, but it is too plain to be true. It is true, but truth is not the only thing in the world." Thus they hide from the light, they burrow and grovel, and yet ever in and through and on them blazes that mighty light with its horror of darkness, and behind it peals the voice, the riddle of the Sphinx, that must be answered. Such a light was the soul of John Brown. He was simple, exasperatingly simple, unlettered, plain, and homely. No casuistry of culture or of learning, of well-being or tradition moved him in the slightest degree. Slavery is wrong, he said. Kill it. Destroy it. Uproot it. Stem, blossom, and branch. Give it no quarter. Exterminate it, and do it now. Was he wrong? No. The forcible stain of human uplift by barriers of law and might and tradition is the most wicked thing on earth. It is wrong, eternally wrong. It is wrong by whatever name it is called, or in whatever guise it lurks, and whenever it appears. But it is especially heinous, black, and cruel when it masquerades in the robes of law and justice and patriotism. So was American slavery clothed in 1859, and it had to die by revolution, not by milder means. And this men knew. They had known it 100 years, yet they shrank and trembled. From round about the white and blinding path of this soul flew equivocations, lies, thievings, and red murders. And yet all men instinctively felt that these things were not of the light, but of the surrounding darkness. It is at once surprising, baffling, and pitiable to see the way in which men, honest American citizens, faced this light. Many types met and answered the argument John Brown. For he did not use argument, he was himself an argument. First there was the Western American, the typical American like Charles Robinson, one to whose imagination the empire of the Vale of the Mississippi appealed with tremendous force. Then there was the abolitionist, shading away from him who held slavery an incubus to him who saw its sin, of whom Gerrit Smith was a fair type. Then there was the lover of men, like Dr. Howe, and the merchant errant like Stearns. Finally, there were the two great fateful types, the master and the slave. To Robinson, Brown was simply a means to an end. Beyond that, he was whatever prevailing public opinion indicated. When the gratitude of Osawatomie swelled high, Brown was fit to be named with Jesus Christ. When the wave of Southern reaction subjugated the nation, he was something less than a fanatic. But whatever he was the sword on which struggling Kansas and its leaders could depend, the untarnished doer of its darker deeds, when they that knew them necessary cowered and held their hands. Brown's was not the only hand that freed Kansas, but his hand was indispensable. And not the first time, nor the last, has a cool and skillful politician like Robinson climbed to power on the heads of those helpers of his whose half-realized ideals he bartered for present possibilities. Human freedom for statehood. For the abolitionist of the Garrison type, Brown had a contempt, as undeserved as it was natural to his genius. To recognize an evil and not strike it was to John Brown sinful. Talk, 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 he said derisively. Nor did he rightly gauge the value of spiritual as contrasted with physical blows, until the day when he himself struck the greatest on the Charleston scaffold. But if John Brown failed rightly to gauge the movement of the abolitionists, few of them failed to appreciate him when they met him. Instinctively, they knew him as one who grasped the very pith and kernel of the evil which they fought. They asked no proofs or credentials. They asked John Brown. So it was with Gerrit Smith. He saw Brown and believed in him. He entertained him at his house. He heard his detailed plans for striking slavery a heart blow. He gave him in all over $1,000 and bade him Godspeed. Yet when the blow was struck, he was filled with immeasurable consternation. He equivocated, and even denied knowledge of Brown's plans. To be sure, he, his family, his fortune were in the shadow of danger. But where was John Brown? So with Dr. Howe, whose memory was painfully poor on the witness stand, and who fluttered from enthusiastic support of Brown to a weak wavering when once he had tasted the famous Southern hospitality. He found slavery, to his own intense surprise, human, not ideally and horribly devilish, but only humanly bad. Was a bad human institution to be attacked vi et armis? Or was it not rather to be met with persuasive argument in the soft shade of a Carolina veranda? Dr. Howe inclined to the latter thought after his Cuban visit, and he was exceedingly annoyed and scared after the raid. He fled precipitately to Canada. Of the Boston Committee, only Stearns stood up and out in the public glare, and said unequivocally, then and there, "I believe John Brown to be the representative man of this century, as Washington was of the last. The Harper's Ferry affair, and the capacity shown by the Italians for self-government, the great events of this age. One will free Europe, and the other America." The attitude of the black man toward John Brown is typified by Frederick Douglass and Shields Green. Said Douglass, "On the evening when the news came that John Brown had taken and was then holding the town of Harper's Ferry, it so happened that I was speaking to a large audience in National Hall, Philadelphia. The announcement came upon us with the startling effect of an earthquake. It was something to make the boldest hold his breath." Wise and Buchanan started immediately on Douglass's track, and he fled to Canada and eventually to England. Why did not Douglass join John Brown? Because, first, he was of an entirely different cast of temperament and mind, and because, secondly, he knew, as only a Negro slave can know, the tremendous might and organization of the slave power. Brown's plan never in the slightest degree appealed to Douglass's reason. That the Underground Railroad methods could be enlarged and systematized, Douglass believed, but any further plan he did not think possible. Only national force could dislodge national slavery. As it was with Douglass, so it was practically with the Negro race. They believed in John Brown, but not in his plan. He touched their warm, loving hearts, but not their hard heads. The Canadian Negroes, for instance, were men who knew what slavery meant. They had suffered its degradation, its repression, and its still more fatal license. They knew the slave system. They had been slaves. They had risked life to help loved ones to escape its far-reaching tentacles. They had reached a land of freedom, and had begun to taste the joy of being human. Their little homes were clustering about. They had their churches, lodges, social gatherings, and newspaper. Then came the call. They loved the old man and cherished him, helped and forwarded his work in 1,000 little ways. But the call? Were they asked to sacrifice themselves to free their fellow slaves? Were they not quite ready? No. To do that, they stood ever ready. But here they were asked to sacrifice themselves for the sake of possibly freeing a few slaves and certainly arousing the nation. They saw what John Brown did not fully realize until the last, the tremendous meaning of sacrifice, even though his enterprise failed, and they were sure it would fail. Yet in truth it need not have failed. History and military science prove its essential soundness. But the Negro knew little of history and military science. He did know slavery and the slave power, and they loomed large and invincible in his fertile imagination. He could not conceive their overthrow by anything short of the direct voice of God. That a supreme sacrifice of human beings on the altar of Moloch might hasten the day of emancipation was possible, but were they called to give their lives to this forlorn hope? Most of them said no, as most of their fellows, black and white, ever answer to the voice without reply. They said it reluctantly, slowly, even hesitatingly, but they said it, even as their leader Douglass said it. And why not, they argued? Was not their whole life already a sacrifice? Were they called by any right of God or man to give more than they already had given? What more did they owe the world? Did not the world owe them an unpayable amount? Then, too, the sacrifice demanded of black men in this raid was far more than that demanded of whites. In 1859 it was a crime for a free black man even to set foot on Virginia soil, and it was slavery or death for a fugitive to return. If worst came to worst, the Negro stood the least chance of escape and the least consideration on capture. Yet despite all this, and despite the terrible training of slavery in cowardice, submission, and fatality, the systematic elimination, by death and cruelty, of strength and self-respect and bravery, there were, in Canada and in the United States, scores of Negroes ready for the sacrifice. But the necessary secrecy, vagueness, and intangibility of the summons, the repeated changes of date, the difficulty of communication, and the poverty of black men, all made effective cooperation exceedingly difficult. Even as it was, 15 or 20 Negroes had enlisted, and would probably have been present had they had the time. 5, probably 6, actually came in time, and 30 or 40 slaves actively helped. Considering the mass of Negroes in the land and the character of the leader, this was an insignificant number. But what it lacked in number it made up in characters like Shields Green. He was a poor, unlettered fugitive, ignorant by the law of the land, stricken in life and homely in body. He sat and listened as Douglas and Brown argued amid the boulders of that old Chambersburg quarry. Some things he understood, some he did not. But one thing he did understand, and that was the soul of John Brown. So he said, "I guess I'll go with the old man." Again, in the sickening fury of that fatal Monday, a white man and a black man found themselves standing with freedom before them. The white man was John Brown's truest companion, and the black man was Shields Green. "I told him to come," said the white man afterward, "that we could do nothing more." But he simply said, "I must go down to the old man," and he went down to John Brown, and to death. If this was the attitude of the slave, what was that of the master? It was when John Brown faced the indignant, self-satisfied, and arrogant slave power of the South, flanked by its northern Vallandigams, that the mighty paradox and burning farce of the situation revealed itself. Picture the situation. An old and blood-bespattered man, half dead from the wounds inflicted but a few hours before. A man lying in the cold and dirt, without sleep for 55 nerve-wrecking hours, without food for nearly as long, with the dead bodies of 2 sons almost before his eyes, the piled corpses of his 7 slain comrades near and afar, a wife and a bereaved family listening in vain, and a lost cause, the dream of a lifetime, lying dead in his heart. Around him was a group of bitter, inquisitive Southern aristocrats and their satellites, headed by one of the foremost leaders of subsequent secession. "Who sent you? Who sent you?" these inquisitors insisted. "No man sent me. I acknowledge no master in human form." "What was your object in coming?" "We came to free the slaves." "How do you justify your acts?" "You are guilty of a great wrong against God and humanity, and it would be perfectly right for anyone to interfere with you so far as to free those you willfully and wickedly hold in bondage. I think I did right, and that others will do right who interfere with you at any time and at all times. I hold that the golden rule, 'Do unto others as ye would that others should do unto you,' applies to all who would help others to gain their liberty." "But don't you believe in the Bible?" "Certainly I do." "Do you consider this a religious movement?" "It is, in my opinion, the greatest service man can render to God." "Do you consider yourself an instrument in the hands of Providence?" "I do." "Upon what principles do you justify your acts?" "Upon the golden rule. I pity the poor in bondage that have none to help them. That is why I am here, not to gratify any personal animosity, revenge, or vindictive spirit. It is my sympathy with the oppressed and the wronged, that are as good as you and as precious in the sight of God." "Certainly; but why take the slaves against their will?" "I never did." "Who are your advisers in this movement?" "I have numerous sympathizers throughout the entire North. I want you to understand that I respect the rights of the poorest and the weakest of colored people oppressed by the slave system just as much as I do those of the most wealthy and powerful. That is the idea that has moved me, and that alone. We expected no reward except satisfaction of endeavoring to do for those in distress and greatly oppressed as we would be done by. The cry of distress of the oppressed is my reason, and the only thing that prompted me to come here. Why did you do it secretly? Because I thought that necessary to success, no other reason. I agree with Mr. Smith that moral suasion is hopeless. I don't think the people of the slave states will ever consider the subject of slavery in its true light till some other argument is resorted to than moral suasion. Did you expect a general rising of the slaves in case of your success? No, sir, nor did I wish it. I expected to gather them up from time to time and set them free. Did you expect to hold possession here till then? You overrate your strength in supposing I could have been taken if I had not allowed it. I was too tardy after commencing the open attack, in delaying my movements through Monday night, and up to the time I was attacked by the government troops. Where did you get your arms? I bought them. In what state? That I will not state. I have nothing to say, only that I claim to be here in carrying out a measure I believe perfectly justifiable, and not to act the part of an incendiary or ruffian, but to aid those suffering great wrong. I wish to say, furthermore, that you had better, all you people at the South, prepare yourselves for a settlement of this question, that must come up for settlement sooner than you are prepared for it. The sooner you are prepared, the better. You may dispose of me very easily. I am nearly disposed of now. But this question is still to be settled. This Negro question, I mean. The end of that is not yet. Brown, suppose you had every nigger in the United States. What would you do with them? Set them free. Your intention was to carry them off and free them? Not at all. To set them free would sacrifice the life of every man in this community. I do not think so. I know it. I think you are fanatical. And I think you are fanatical. Whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad, and you are mad. Was it your only object to free the negroes? Absolutely our only object. You are a robber, cried some voice in the crowd. You slaveholders are robbers, retorted Brown. But Governor Wise interrupted. Mr. Brown, the silver of your hair is reddened by the blood of crime, and you should eschew these hard words and think upon eternity. You are suffering from wounds, perhaps fatal, and should you escape death from these causes, you must submit to a trial which may involve death. Your confessions justify the presumption that you will be found guilty, and even now you are committing a felony under the laws of Virginia by uttering sentiments like these. It is better you should turn your attention to your eternal future than be dealing in denunciations which can only injure you. John Brown replied, Governor, I have, from all appearances, not more than 15 or 20 years the start of you in the journey to that eternity of which you kindly warn me, and whether my time here shall be 15 months, or 15 days, or 15 hours, I am equally prepared to go. There is an eternity behind and an eternity before, and this little speck in the center, however long, is but comparatively a minute. The difference between your tenure and mine is trifling, and I therefore tell you to be prepared. I am prepared. You have a heavy responsibility, and it behooves you to prepare more than it does me. Thus, from the day John Brown was captured to the day he died, and after, it was the South and slavery that was on trial, not John Brown. Indeed, the dilemma into which John Brown's raid threw the state of Virginia was perfect. If his foray was the work of a handful of fanatics, led by a lunatic and repudiated by the slaves to a man, then the proper procedure would have been to ignore the incident, quietly punish the worst offenders, and either pardon the misguided leader or send him to an asylum. If, on the other hand, Virginia faced a conspiracy that threatened her social existence, aroused dangerous unrest in her slave population, and was full of portent for the future, then extraordinary precaution, swift and extreme punishment, and bitter complaint were only natural. But both these situations could not be true. Both horns of the dilemma could not be logically seized. Yet this was precisely what the South and Virginia sought. While insisting that the raid was too hopelessly and ridiculously small to accomplish anything, and saying, with Andrew Hunter, that not a single one of the slaves joined John Brown except by coercion, the state nevertheless spent $250,000 to punish the invaders, stationed from 1 to 3,000 soldiers in the vicinity, and threw the nation into turmoil. When the inconsistency of this action struck various minds, the attempt was made to exaggerate the danger of the invading white men. The presiding judge at the trial wrote, as late as 1889, that the number in Brown's party was proven by witnesses to have been 75 to 100, and he expected large reinforcements, while Andrew Hunter, the state's attorney, saw nationwide conspiracies. What then was the truth about the matter? It was as Frederick Douglass said 22 years later on the very spot. If John Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he did at least begin the war that ended slavery. If we look over the dates, places, and men for which this honor is claimed, we shall find that not Carolina, but Virginia, not Fort Sumter, but Harper's Ferry and the Arsenal, not Major Anderson, but John Brown, began the war that ended American slavery and made this a free republic. Until this blow was struck, the prospect for freedom was dim, shadowy, and uncertain. The irrepressible conflict was one of words, votes, and compromises. When John Brown stretched forth his arm, the sky was cleared. The armed hosts of freedom stood face to face over the chasm of a broken union, and the clash of arms was at hand. The paths by which John Brown's raid precipitated civil war were these. In the first place, he aroused the negroes of Virginia. How far the knowledge of his plan had penetrated is of course only to be conjectured. Evidently few knew that the foray would take place on October 17th. But when the movement had once made a successful start, there is no doubt that Osborne Anderson knew whereof he spoke when he said that slaves were ready to cooperate. His words were proven by the 200,000 black soldiers in the Civil War. That something was wrong was shown too by 5 incendiary fires in a single week after the raid. Hunter sought to attribute these to Northern emissaries, but this charge was unproven and extremely improbable. The only other possible perpetrators were slaves and free negroes. That Virginians believed this is shown by Hinton's declaration that the loss in 1859 by the sale of Virginia slaves alone was $10 million. A lady who visited John Brown said, "It was hard for me to forget the presence of the jailer. I had that morning seen his advertisement of 50 negroes for sale." It is impossible to prove the extent of this clearing out of suspected slaves, but the census reports indicate something of it. The Negro population of Maryland and Virginia increased a little over 4% between 1850 and 1860, but in the 3 counties bordering on Harper's Ferry, Loudoun and Jefferson in Virginia, and Washington in Maryland, the 17,647 slaves of 1850 had shrunk to 15,996 in 1860, a decrease of nearly 10%. This means a disappearance of 2,400 slaves, and is very significant. Secondly, long before John Brown appeared at Harper's Ferry, Southern leaders like Mason, the author of the Fugitive Slave Bill and chairman of the Harper's Ferry Investigating Committee, Jefferson Davis, who was a member of this committee, Wise, Hunter, and other Virginians, had set their faces toward secession as the only method of protecting slavery. Into the mouths of these men John Brown put a tremendous argument and a fearful warning. The argument they used, the warning they suppressed and hushed. The argument was, this is abolitionism, this is the North. This is the kind of treatment which the South and its cherished institution can expect, unless it resorts to extreme measures. Proceeding along these lines, they emphasized and enlarged the raid so far as its white participants and Northern sympathizers were concerned. Governor Wise, on November 25th, issued a burning manifesto for the ears of the South and the eyes of President Buchanan, and the majority report of the Senate committee closed with ominous words. On the other hand, the warning of John Brown's raid, the danger of Negro insurrection, was but whispered. Third, and this was the path that led to civil war and far beyond, the raid aroused and directed the conscience of the nation. Strange it was to watch its work. Some impulsive, eager to justify themselves, rushed into print. To Garrison, the non-resistant, the sword of Gideon was abhorrent. Beecher thundered against John Brown, and Seward bitterly traduced him. Then came an ominous silence in the land, while his voice, in his own defense, was heard over the whole country. A great surging throb of sympathy arose and swept the world. That John Brown was legally a lawbreaker and a murderer, all men knew. But wider and wider circles were beginning, dimly and more clearly, to recognize that his lawlessness was in obedience to the highest call of self-sacrifice for the welfare of his fellow men. They began to ask themselves, what is this cause that can inspire such devotion? The reiteration of the simple statement of the brother in bonds could not help but attract attention. The beauty of the conception, despite its possible unearthliness and impracticability, attracted poet and philosopher and common man. To be sure, the nation had long been thinking over the problem of the black man, but never before had its attention been held by such deep dramatic and personal interest as in the 40 days from mid-October to December 1859. This arresting of national attention was due to Virginia and to John Brown. To Virginia, by reason of its exaggerated plaint; to John Brown, whose strength, simplicity, and acumen made his trial, incarceration, and execution the most powerful abolition argument yet offered. The very processes by which Virginia used John Brown to fire the Southern heart were used by John Brown to fire the Northern conscience. Andrew Hunter, the prosecuting state's attorney, of right demanded that the trial should be short and the punishment swift, and in this John Brown fully agreed. He had no desire to escape the consequences of his act or to clog the wheels of Virginia justice. After a certain moral bewilderment there in the old engine house at his failure on the brink of success, the true significance of his mission of sacrifice slowly rose before him. In the face of proposals to rescue him, he said, at first thoughtfully, "I do not know that I ought to encourage any attempt to save my life. I am not sure that it would not be better for me to die at this time. I am not incapable of error, and I may be wrong, but I think that perhaps my object would be nearer fulfillment if I should die. I must give it some thought." And more this conviction seized and thrilled him, and he began to say decisively, "I think I cannot now better serve the cause I love so much than to die for it, and in my death I may do more than in my life." And again, "I can trust God with both the time and the manner of my death, believing, as I do now, that for me at this time to seal my testimony for God and humanity with my blood will do vastly more toward advancing the cause I have earnestly endeavored to promote than all I have done in my life before." And then finally came that last great hymn of utter sacrifice. I feel astonished that one so vile and unworthy as I am would even be suffered to have a place anyhow or anywhere amongst the very least of all who when they came to die, as all must, were permitted to pay the debt of nature in defense of the right and of God's eternal and immutable truth. The trial was a difficult experience. Virginia attempted to hold scales of even justice between mob violence and the world-wide sympathy of all good men. To defend its domestic institutions, it must try a man for murder when that very man, sitting as self-appointed judge of those very institutions, had convicted them before a jury of mankind. To defend the good name of the state, Virginia had to restrain the violent blood vengeance of men whose kin had been killed in the raid, and who had sworn that no prisoner should escape the extreme penalty. The trial was legally fair, but pressed to a conclusion in unseemly haste, and in obedience to a threatening public opinion and a great hovering dread. Only against this unfair haste did John Brown protest, for he wanted the world to understand why he had done the deed. On the other hand, Hunter not only feared the local mob, but the slowly arising sentiment for this white-haired crusader. He therefore pushed the proceedings legally, but with almost brutal pertinacity. The prisoner was arraigned while wounded and in bed. The lawyers, hurriedly chosen, were given scant time for consultation or preparation. John Brown was formally committed to jail at Charlestown, the county seat, on October 20th, had a preliminary examination October 25th, and was indicted by the grand jury October 26th, for conspiracy with slaves for the purpose of insurrection, with treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, and with murder in the first degree. Thursday, October 27th, his trial was begun. A jury was impaneled without challenge, and Brown's lawyers, ignoring his outline of defense, brought in the plea of insanity. The old man arose from his couch and said, "I look upon it as a miserable artifice and pretext of those who ought to take a different course in regard to me, if they took any at all, and I view it with contempt more than otherwise. I am perfectly unconscious of insanity, and I reject, so far as I am capable, any attempts to interfere in my behalf on that score." On Friday a Massachusetts lawyer arrived to help in the trial, and also privately to suggest methods of escape. John Brown quietly refused to contemplate any such attempt, but was glad to accept the aid of this lawyer and two others, who were sent by John A. Andrew and his friends. The judge curtly refused these men any time to prepare their case, but in spite of this, it ran over until Monday, when the jury retired. Late Monday afternoon they returned. Redpath says: "At this moment the crowd filled all the space from the couch inside the bar, around the prisoner, beyond the railing in the body of the court, out through the wide hall, and beyond the doors. There stood the anxious but perfectly silent and attentive populace, stretching head and neck to witness the closing scene of Old Brown's trial. The clerk of the court read the indictment and asked, 'Gentlemen of the jury, what say you? Is the prisoner at the bar, John Brown, guilty or not guilty?' 'Guilty,' answered the foreman. 'Guilty of treason and conspiring and advising with slaves and others to rebel, and murder in the first degree?' 'Yes.' Redpath continues: "Not the slightest sound was heard in this vast crowd as this verdict was thus returned and read. Not the slightest expression of elation or triumph was uttered from the hundreds present, who, a moment before, outside the court, joined in heaping threats and imprecations on his head. Nor was this strange silence interrupted during the whole of the time occupied by the forms of the court. Old Brown himself said not even a word, but, as on any previous day, turned to adjust his pallet, and then composedly stretched himself upon it. The following Wednesday John Brown was sentenced. Moving with painful steps and pale face, he took his seat under the gaslight in the great square room and remained motionless. The judge read his decision on the points of exception, and the clerk asked, 'Have you anything to say why sentence of death should not be passed upon you?' Then, rising and leaning forward, John Brown made that last great speech, in a voice at once gentle and firm. 'I have, may it please the court, a few words to say. In the first place, I deny everything but what I have all along admitted, the design on my part to free the slaves. I intended certainly to have made a clean thing of that matter, as I did last winter, when I went into Missouri, and there took slaves without the snapping of a gun on either side, moved them through the country, and finally left them in Canada. I designed to have done the same thing again on a larger scale. That was all I intended. I never did intend murder or treason or the destruction of property, or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion, or to make insurrection. I have another objection, and that is, it is unjust that I should suffer such a penalty. Had I interfered in the matter which I admit, and which I admit has been fairly proved, for I admire the truthfulness and candor of the greater portion of the witnesses who have testified in this case, had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. This court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament. That teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them. I endeavor to act up to that instruction. I say, I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country, whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit. So let it be done. Let me say one word further. I feel entirely satisfied with the treatment I have received on my trial. Considering all the circumstances, it has been more generous than I expected. But I feel no consciousness of guilt. I have stated from the first what was my intention and what was not. I never had any design against the life of any person, nor any disposition to commit treason, or excite slaves to rebel, or make any general insurrection. I never encouraged any man to do so, but always discouraged any idea of that kind. Let me say also a word in regard to the statements made by some of those connected with me. I hear it has been stated by some of them that I have induced them to join me, but the contrary is true. I do not say this to injure them, but as regretting their weakness. There is not one of them but that joined me of his own accord, and the greater part at their own expense. A number of them I never saw, and never had a word of conversation with, till the day they came to me, and that was for the purpose I have stated. Now I have done. The day of his dying, December 2nd, dawned glorious. 24 hours before he had kissed his wife good-bye, and on this morning he visited his doomed companions, Shields Green and Copeland first, then the wavering Cook and Coppoc, and the unmovable Stevens. At last he turned toward the place of his hanging. Since early morning 3,000 soldiers had been marching and countermarching around the scaffold, which had been erected a half-mile from Charlestown, encircling it for 15 miles. A hush sat on the hearts of men. John Brown rode out into the morning. "This is a beautiful land," he said. It was beautiful. Wide, glistening, rolling fields flickered in the sunlight. Beyond, the Shenandoah went rolling northward, and still afar rose the mighty masses of the Blue Ridge, where Nat Turner had fought and died, where Gabriel had looked for refuge, and where John Brown had builded his awful dream. Some say he kissed a negro child as he passed, but Andrew Hunter vehemently denies it. No negro could get access to him, he says, and he is probably right. And yet all about him as he hung there knelt the funeral guard he prayed for when he said, My love to all who love their neighbors. I have asked to be spared from having any weak or hypocritical prayers made over me when I am publicly murdered, and that my only religious attendants be poor little dirty, ragged, bareheaded and barefooted slave boys and girls, led by some gray haired slave mother. Farewell, farewell.